Hey, this is Brian.
And Shelby.
And you're listening to the Hyperspace
Pod Blast. Aren't you a little short for a podcast?
Huh?
It's the Hyperspace Pod Blast Show.
I liked that one.
Thank you. I added the little raspberry at the end on a whim.
Enjoyable.
Thanks.
What are we talking about today, Brian?
We are doing shared storytelling. We were sort of inspired by the way the Avengers Infinity War came together and was like a culmination of 10 years worth of cinematic storytelling. So we were thinking, Star Wars kind of does that. We can riff on this.
Yeah. Conversation over lunch. And a couple of beers. What?
Shh, it's PG.
So, what are some examples of shared storytelling that come to mind when you think of it?
The first thing I always think of are like television shows, because so often they're episodically written by different people, but you have this sort of, I don't know, showrunner or whatever they call it, overseer, that kind of hems everything together into the article of clothing that it is.
That's a good point. Honestly, I never think about different episodes of TV shows being directed by different people.
Yeah, directed, written,
yeah, all that
produced,
stuff.
like
I never
all
think
that,
about
yeah.
that, but it's true. And it's interesting because that's the whole point. I never think about it. So that
right,
obviously
exactly.
means that they
It's
do a good job.
working. Of course, there's certain things, like there was that episode of Adventure Time that had a different creative behind it, but it was like
It's like a guest.
but instead of him creating something for Adventure Time, he basically took Adventure Time and like put it into what he does. It was really strange.
I still liked it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can tell when there's times like that sometimes.
Right.
Like there's been a couple of instances. I don't know. When I think of like when someone says shared storytelling, the very first thing I think about is like RPGs, like Dungeons and Dragons style, because that's such a shared narrative.
Right,
which
exactly.
is what like makes a good DM, is someone who can control that and still like focus it in a way that isn't controlling to the players.
Yeah, and it's, I think, to tie it back to what we've already been talking about with TV shows, I think that's kind of how the showrunner works, you know what I mean? Like if you have a DM that basically really just wants you to walk through his story, that's not that much fun. Like he basically just makes all your cool ideas not work so that you have to do his thing. And that I can see like someone that has really tight creative control over whatever they're doing being like, oh yeah, no, sorry, you can't do that in my show. So same kind of thing. But yeah, when the DM's just there to sort of guide things and put obstacles in the way, and then they let the player figure out what to do about it, then it becomes everyone is creating what the ultimate story becomes. And that's a really good point.
Yeah, it's a lot like any sort of like improv class you would be in. The whole like yes and.
Yeah.
You have to have that dependent.
I heard a pet store and a station wagon.
Which is like that trust between creatives too. Like that has to exist to make a good story, because if you have someone that isn't saying yes and.
Right, it's yes but.
Yeah.
And I feel like
that sometimes happens with Star Wars.
Yeah.
But we'll get to that part. What else do you think about when you think of shared storytelling?
One good thing that I think you brought up is the long-running comic books. Like, you know, there's, especially in the Marvel universe, because I'm going to speak on that's what I'm most familiar with. You have all these characters that Stan Lee created, but he hasn't written for, you know, decades, I imagine. I don't really keep up on the ins and outs of it. But, you know, like Spider-Man exists in this long narrative that several people have been involved in. But then they also have like just reboots and rehashes and AUs and all these different things now. So that kind of gets into a whole different can of worms. But the whole idea of a character that is sort of handed off, and they do the same thing with art too. You know, a new artist comes on and he's going to interpret what the writer writes differently than the other artist would. And especially with comic books, that what you see is a big part of the story. So if you have a different artist, even interpreting the same writer's work, it can feel like, you know, a little bit of a shakeup, but still it's that. And I mean, comics in general, I guess, is shared storytelling because you have two people involved, unless it's a writer.
That's
artist.
so true, because you could write something, and the way that, I mean, you have general connotation for words and then personal connotation for words.
True.
So whatever that artist's personal connotation for words is going to be reflected in the way that they draw a character, the way that they react, especially, you know, when you think about like interpersonal reactions in a comic, the way that someone is interacting with someone else, that personal language could be very different, especially with their body language.
Right, exactly. Like what someone does when they're...
if their arms are crossed while they're saying it.
Exactly.
Things like that. Those sorts of decisions.
Everyone puts their own poker face on there when they're trying to be shady. Yeah.
I always think about oral history, too, with shared storytelling. Things that are passed on through not written stories, but just the way that people pass them on. That whole telephone game. And you have it with, you know, the myths and legends.
True.
How things like that get passed down. Or even just the way that things are sensationally rewritten to sell books.
Yeah, that's true. That's another sort of like reboot, rehash thing. I think we've talked about this a couple times, but the whole Arthurian legend is one of the things I always bring up because there's so many different versions of that. And, you know, some people claim it's real at some point, but I don't know if there's anything that...
Yeah, I mean, we have so many things in even like American history that are written just to be sensational.
Oh, well,
which
absolutely.
is so, I mean, you see it all over history, but that's so interesting to think, like, it doesn't make it a bad story, though.
Right, yeah. Just
it's a
because
good
it
story.
isn't true, yeah. Like they say, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Yeah. But it's interesting.
You know, if you're a tight-held creative, don't let someone else's ideas get in the way of your story.
Oh.
I think that's...
Yeah.
They misinterpret the whole quote there. But anyway.
Yeah. I just think that there's a lot of shared storytelling that happens in our pop culture that we just don't really focus on. I mean, even the creation of a movie in itself, like one singular movie, you have so many different hands on it. It's not just the director.
Well, yeah, you have director, writers, sometimes writers.
I mean, think about how many names you see when the credits roll.
True.
All those people had an impact on how that story was told to you.
Well, and just like we were saying with comic books, the cinematography, how a scene is shot, you know, the director tells the actors what to do, the writer wrote the lines, the cinematographer figures out, you know, how you're gonna make it look.
Right. I mean, we were talking about how much we loved the scene where Leia pulls herself through space, but it felt weird just the way it was shot.
Right, exactly.
Like, it's interesting that one person in the whole creation of that scene can change how you interpret if you like it or not.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, if it would have been done differently, how it would have been received, even though technically it's the same thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's a good point. And two, I guess to circle back to the Avengers, look how many people are involved in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, but it seems to be a very cohesive storytelling experience. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
You don't get that kind of, oh, this movie felt off. It didn't seem like, why would this character do that? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's little minor, what's his motivation? Why did he do that type things? But there's no like glaring, oh, I'm deciding to do this with this character type thing.
I agree. So what do you think the benefits of shared storytelling are?
The more hands and eyes you have on something to mold it to where it's just right, the better, I think. Especially, I have this problem as someone who feigns to be creative as well. I have an idea and I get it down on paper and then I fall in love with it, and then when someone tells me, oh, why don't you change this, I'm like, no, it's perfect. So I'm afraid, unfortunately, like you sort of alluded to, I think that's kind of what happened with the prequels, where in the original trilogy, George was much more...
challenged, probably.
Well, challenged, and he had more voices, more people telling him no, I think.
Well, do you ever think it gets to a point where there's like too many cooks in the kitchen?
There definitely can be, yeah. Then you can't decide on anything. That's why you need that one person that's like ultimately has the say, I think, or at least some small contingent of people that come to a consensus. But it can be bad either way. If you have too many people and they're all acquiescing to each other, then you end up with I don't know, nothing maybe. And then if you have the prequel George Lucas situation, you have everyone just saying, yes sir, great idea, Mr. Lucas, and C-3PO ends up being built by Anakin.
Huh?
Anyway.
That's your big thing. It always is. No, I think I think you really grasped all of the things that I would want to say about the benefits of shared storytelling. I think it allows people to stay in check, because a lot of times people can go down their own rabbit trail and really get into the weeds with what they think is good and what they want.
Well, I mean,
which is what fans do all the time.
Right. That's
we
what
always
I was just
are like,
say.
We're like, this is what should have happened because this is what I want to happen.
Exactly.
Well, the reason that didn't happen is because there were 3 other people in the room who were like, no, I don't like that idea.
Yeah, like we've said before, if each of us wrote The Last Jedi, it would have been a terrible movie, but we would have loved it.
Exactly.
So it's that kind of same circumstance, I think. So what do you think the drawbacks or limitations can be? I guess we already talked about a few of these, but in more negatively, what can shared storytelling do that's bad?
I don't know. I think that sometimes it morphs what the original thought was. I think that you're going to inevitably get that. Like, there's an original thought, and whenever it passes through that many hands, like a telephone game, it gets changed. Sometimes that's for the better. Sometimes I think maybe it's not. Like, it's just like a chance sort of thing.
Well, and I think it has also, if you think about things that are done with the same group, and then the baton sort of gets passed, and then someone else picks it up, and they're like, well, I'm going to change all of this because I don't like this. And it becomes that sort of, again, that personal battle versus the way the story would maybe actually go.
I think some people probably aren't as accepting of what they're given in a shared storytelling, and they just want to like, okay, how can I undo this to make it what I want it to be?
Yeah.
I'm sure that if you were given something that someone else wrote and like, okay, write the rest of this book, like someone gave you half of a book and you had to write the rest of the half, how much time would you spend undoing something that you think is stupid?
Oh, like all of it?
Yeah. Instead of just like taking it and being like, well, this is the story I was given. How do I stay true to it and make it feel like someone didn't change halfway through?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good way to say it. And I guess to throw the DC people a bone, I just thought of like the very old Batman, which the one that started with Michael Keaton, and the first 2 movies have a very like continued narrative feel to them. And then the baton got passed to a much different creative group, and then oh boy, did it get weird.
I think we see some good examples of it too.
I agree.
Like, I don't know. I'm thinking about...
Well, the MCU, like we already said, like that's almost the gold standard, I think.
Yeah.
At this point.
I think it's really great.
It's hard to beat. Like even if you don't like every movie, or, you know, they don't all work for you, I don't think you can say, you know, without lying a little bit to yourself, that they don't at least work together.
Yeah.
Maybe you thought Ant-Man was too corny. Maybe you think Guardians is dumb, and then we're no longer friends. But whatever. Maybe some of the parts of the whole don't work for you. But...
I don't know. Maybe that's the whole genius part, is that it appeals to so many different people.
Yeah, I think that helps
That
too.
might be it.
Well,
the fact that they have some like stuff that strays just a little bit from the path, that it grabs that specific group of people that likes that certain thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, then you bring them into the whole with the Avengers movies. So yeah.
Anyway, continue with what you were saying. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, I mean, I think that's it. Just that, like, that is how you do it well. And then there's, you know, versions of, even within, and I'm going to knock on the DC Cinematic Universe, or DCE, whatever they call it. I haven't seen any of the movies, but they look bad. And each one of them looks like its own movie, even though it's supposed to be a contained story. And I don't know what they're doing, but I feel like they're doing it wrong. I feel like they tried to copy the MCU, but then they're like, well, no, we have to make it different, when they should have been like, we should just straight up copy this.
Oh, man. So how do you think that, like, creation date impacts shared storytelling? You know, we have the MCU, there's like 10 years in the making. But then you also have stuff like Star Wars. Let's actually talk about Star Wars on our Star Wars podcast.
Right.
That you have stories like Rogue One and A New Hope. How many years are between those?
Oh, geez.
Decades. Sorry, decades. Yeah. So
when did it come out? 2016, so 40-ish years.
Yeah,
because it was the 40th anniversary.
Yes.
Is when.
So think about the fact that they've created 2 stories, 2 movies, especially one being a not saga like film. And in my opinion, they merge so well together as far as feel and tone and dynamic.
I agree.
But how do you think that the creation date impacts it? Do you think it is a huge significant factor or no?
I think it can be. Again, to talk about the prequels, let's think we have George Lucas, younger man, making his original space opera, right? And then he comes back as an older father figure, or, actual father, I guess. And he creates the prequels where it's this weird mix of like a political catastrophe film and a corny pratfall Jar Jar Binks extravaganza. It has a lot more, I think it feels a lot more kid-centric because I think he had his kids in mind when he was making it, especially with Jar Jar. Like, if you look at Jar Jar through the eyes of like a 5-year-old, he's awesome.
Yeah.
But most of the people that hate Jar Jar are people my age or older that, that doesn't necessarily appeal to them anymore.
Plus, I think you have to take into consideration the advancement of technology and special effects.
True.
Like, that can have a huge impact. And I think maybe that's one of the most jarring things that can be between 2 films is just the advancement in film and the ability, the way that it looks.
With that genre, but even still, like with comic books, like the art styles and just, the coloration, the things you can do.
Yeah.
You don't have like basically 4 color things. Everything's either red, yellow, green, or blue.
I am really impressed with what Blade Runner did.
Yes.
That is a huge advancement in technology and something that's very dependent on technology, and yet they made it feel very cohesive.
I agree at 100%. And, maybe this is just because I think that movie is a triumph. But yeah, the 2049 and Blade Runner really do go together. They both, I think part of it is the music, which we haven't touched on, but keeping that thread really helps.
Yeah, maybe that's what helps Star Wars a lot too.
I think Jurassic Park too just came to mind.
Yeah.
All those movies. That's another one that kind of flew downhill, but then they brought it back. I actually like Jurassic World.
Me too.
Bad footwear choices aside.
Yeah.
But yeah, the music, the tone, the feel, they captured everything. They even captured Han Solo, got him back. It's a Harrison Ford joke, everyone. But yeah, it's really good. But the same, well, at least a lot of similar people worked on that one though. So you have that time gap that creates kind of the same thing where, again, like we said with the prequels, there's certainly a lot of the same voices working together, but then they made 3 very different movies from the original trilogy, but they still work together, I think. But again, there's kind of a big time gap within the narrative there that helps move that and make that go together. Kind of like the same thing with the new trilogy that's hard to really talk about because it's unfinished. But
yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of this stems from, I think you and I both share a dissatisfaction of the feeling of cohesiveness between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi.
Yeah, and that's another thing that kind of...
It's so interesting that both of those have, I mean, as far as production goes, like a year between them.
Well, and it's ironic, too.
And yet they don't feel very...
Yeah.
They feel more disjointed than Rogue One and A New Hope.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly that. And it's funny that story time, there's like it just...
Same with, I mean, it's the same amount of time between the two of those as Rogue One and A New Hope.
Right, pretty much. And Rogue One and A New Hope seems almost like it could just be one long movie, where if you watch The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi back to back, they feel like 2 very different movies.
Yes.
Like almost everything about them just doesn't even add up, but here they are.
And I like them both independently as really good movies. Mm-hmm. It's just I personally don't think that they go together very well.
Yeah, and I think we even said this on our after the Last Jedi show. Someone forgot to tell Ryan he was doing the middle movie.
Yeah.
that could have been a standalone movie.
Yes.
Almost. Like, it feels like that was its own thing. I don't know. I don't know what JJ is going to do now. Side eye Ryan Johnson really hard, I think. Yeah, it's weird how you have, like you said, it should be something that is seamless. Like, you have 2 movies with a 40-year time gap that works better than 2 movies that were shot and developed like one after the other. That shouldn't be a thing.
Yeah, it's strange. And so I know we're talking about movies mostly, but how do you think that if you kind of go pre-Disney, I know, the dark times.
Legends.
Whatever you want to talk about, however you want to describe that time. How do you think that shared storytelling happened with the books?
That was an interesting one because, especially with things like the New Jedi Order, you had a lot of different authors being involved in that, but it did feel like a continued narrative that wasn't, you didn't have a lot of that, I'm gonna break all your toys and hand you back, good luck. But yeah, I think too, though, there's something just about all the other stuff with Star Wars that you can let a little more slide. I think we've talked about this before, which I guess is my mantra for this episode, but there's like a tier, you have the movies, and I think that's just because of what people talk about the most, what the most people see, what the overwhelming conversation is about,
what most people consume.
Right, exactly. And then as it goes down, you kind of paint yourself into that super fan corner where, I don't know, I feel like the more you like something, the more you're willing to
accept some things that are a little stretch. Yeah.
So that being said, maybe I overlook things, but to me, I think most of those series, like the longer series that had different authors, definitely worked very well. And then you have obviously the Thrawn trilogy that was all written by Tim Zahn that works really well because
I wonder how that would have been if you had 3 different authors.
Yeah,
because you think about trilogies, you always think about any sort of trilogy, like when people write things, it's always the same author.
Yeah, imagine if the middle Tolkien book would have been somebody else.
C.S. Lewis. I don't even know.
Everybody leaves the little hold area through a closet and they come out just fine on the other end. That's how they escape.
And then it's terrible.
Yeah. And then,
and then everyone dies.
Yeah. And then it turns out that it landed you in Mordor. It was just a really sunny day.
So how do you think, finally, what do you think Star Wars needs to make shared storytelling work, and why do you think some stories thread together better than others?
Honestly, as far as what we just talked about with the EU stuff, I don't know how they did that, as far as how they attacked that narrative. If they had a big group meeting and they had like the story arcs already figured out, and then like, all right, you take on this bit, you take on this bit type thing. I'm assuming that's how it worked. And I would think they would do well for themselves to do that with the films. I think that's why sort of now, after they've gone through the growing pains, I guess, you see them announcing trilogies that are going to be run by people instead of, hey, we're going to make 3 more movies, but we're just going to wing it.
Yeah.
So I think they maybe have learned from this whole JJ, Ryan, JJ, or, what ended up being JJ wasn't. Imagine a third voice at the end of this thing. Who knows what we would have ended up with.
Gosh.
Yeah, I don't know. Rey running from a Rancor in high heels.
Oh, come on.
Sorry.
Come on.
Anyway. Yeah, I think what they need, or what's different and sort of what makes it feel disjointed, is before, even though Lucas changed his mind a lot, and they have all these interviews and things that say he didn't know how the story was going to go, he had some idea, and it was his creative thing, so it was at least his
it's
overarching
just the same
narrative.
Voice.
Yeah,
because guess what? Something that would be completely outside the box for one person is always outside that box for that one person.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there were hard no's on things, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That other people may have
been like, maybe. Yeah,
right.
I agree with you. I think that's kind of what we need. I think we need some consistency between stuff that is supposed to be consistent.
Right.
A trilogy is supposed to be consistent.
Well,
even if you have, like, whatever movies are announced after this, any sort of trilogies, if they're very different, I feel like that's kind of okay to be very different as a group. But whenever it's a group and it's very different within the same group, that's when things get kind of hairy.
Right, especially with the episodic, the 7, 8, 9 should feel like one large story.
Yeah, and it does not.
Well, and
we've already messed that up. Like, that's, it's over.
To us, yes. I mean, maybe
Some
somehow.
people may think that it flows.
Well, true. And when you get that third, that bookend,
Maybe
we'll look at it and be like, okay, I see this now. Like, we're only looking at part of the picture, so it's like
Work
one
your
of
magic,
those.
JJ.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what those. It's some old game where you're trying to figure out what the picture was, and you like reveal little pieces at a time. And we're trying to put this picture together, and we don't see it all. But it's a Star Wars podcast. That's what we do. But yeah, I think the whole idea of having someone that is the overseer, the main storyboarder, like, here are the main plot points, you figure out how we get there, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what they do with Rebels, which it works as a narrative. I don't necessarily like all the choices they made, but I don't think
it works as a narrative.
Yeah, I don't
Absolutely.
think it's necessarily disjointed.
No, it
I
feels...
think especially if you started the second season on, it's you have that sort of mysterious Force stuff and all that.
Yeah.
The first season, the best one.
Oh my God.
Stays away from that a little bit, but anyway, yeah, I think that's probably one of the best new examples is Rebels, as far as getting things where you have a very obvious, I think, hierarchy of how things work, because you had, again, a lot of voices involved in that, but it felt like one thing.
I agree.
Huzzah!
Awesome. So that concludes our very cohesive and put together podcast between two people.
This is shared podcasting.
Anyway, we'll see what I come up with editing. Anyway, another storytelling device.
True.
You can always find us at hyperspace_pod on Twitter.
You can email us at hyperspacepodblast@gmail.com.
Or check out our website, hyperspacepodblast.com. We will talk to you guys later, and we have some cool stuff in store for you coming out soon. That's a sound.
That's my excited
All
sound.
right. Bye.
Bye.